February 22nd, 1945. 2:10 a.m. Outside Prüm, Western Germany. The forest was black and silent, the kind of winter darkness that seemed to press down on the helmet and shoulders. Snow had fallen earlier, then hardened into a crust. Each step made a small, dry crack beneath a boot sole. A narrow road cut through the pines, marked by ruts and frozen mud, and along that road a German convoy sat in place like something abandoned. Trucks with canvas backs, a staff car, a fuel bowser with a dented cylinder, two half-tracks angled into the ditch as if someone had tried to turn around and failed. There was no enemy fire. There was no drama, only the sound of an engine that refused to start. Major Karl-Heinz Voss stood beside the staff car with his hands tucked under his coat, watching his driver work the starter again and again until the battery began to die. The starter motor whined, thin and hopeless, and then gave up. The driver looked up, ashamed, and shook his head. "Nothing, Herr Major." Voss nodded once, as if this was simply another report to file. But his eyes moved automatically to the same place they had moved for weeks now, the fuel gauge. The needle rested on empty. It did not tremble. It did not lie. He walked past the car and toward the bowser. A corporal was already there, unscrewing the cap, lifting it, peering into darkness. The corporal tilted the cap back and forth as if the sound might reveal a hidden pool. Then he looked at Voss and made a small motion with his fingers. Nothing. "Reserve?" Voss asked. The corporal swallowed. "Reserve is dry, Herr Major." A narrow beam of light cut across the bowser's metal flank. Someone had brought a lantern close enough to read the chalk markings written on the side. Voss leaned in. The words were smudged but legible. Allocated, 1,200 liters. Issued, 1,200 liters. Balance, 0. It was not a battlefield problem. It was arithmetic. Voss was not a frontline hero. He was not a tank ace, not an SS commander, not a man whose story would be told in memoirs or films. He was a staff officer in logistics, a man who moved the war instead of fighting it, who kept lists of what could be moved and what could not. If the war was a machine, he worked in the room where the machine was fed. And for months now, his job had become an exercise in turning pages that said the same thing in different fonts. Empty, empty, empty. Behind him, a lieutenant approached with a folder pressed against his chest, breath coming out in quick, white bursts. He spoke quietly, as if loud words would break something fragile. "Herr Major, the Americans have taken Bitburg. The road is cut. We have no rail, no trucks, no fuel." Voss did not answer immediately. He stared at the chalk line again. Balance, 0, and felt something settle behind his ribs. Not fear, not anger, something colder and heavier than both. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper he had been carrying for days. It was creased and softened at the corners, handled too often. A receipt. The lieutenant watched him unfold it, puzzled. Voss held it in the lantern light. It was printed in English. A simple form, stamped and signed, listing quantities in neat rows. Gasoline, diesel, lubricants, spare parts. The date at the top read February 12th, 10 days ago. The place of issue, Antwerp. And beside the quantities, an abbreviation that had become the most frightening word Voss had ever learned in a foreign language. Unlimited. Unlimited fuel authorized for movement. Unlimited motor oil for operational tempo. Unlimited spare tires for convoy rotation. The lieutenant blinked. "Herr Major, what is that?" Voss looked up from the receipt. His face was calm in the lantern glow, but his eyes had gone far away. "That," he said, "is the reason we cannot win." Chapter 1. The War of Shortages. The American invasion had not defeated Germany in one moment. It had not been a single battle or a single breakthrough. It had been a slow, grinding revelation that Germany was no longer fighting a war of tactics, but a war of supply, and that the enemy across the lines had turned supply into an ocean. By early 1945, German units did not ask for victory, they asked for motion. A battalion commander requested fuel for a counterattack and received enough for a short relocation. A division requested trains and received wagons without locomotives. A corps requested new vehicles and received instructions to salvage enemy equipment and keep it running as long as it could. Fuel was not just scarce. Fuel had become a kind of myth, spoken of with the hunger people usually reserved for bread. The German war economy had been strangled slowly and deliberately. Allied bombing had not simply targeted factories, it had targeted the lifeblood beneath them: refineries, synthetic fuel plants, rail junctions, pipelines, depots. The Reich could still produce weapons, but it could not reliably deliver them. It could still train soldiers, but it could not consistently move them. Every German officer by 1945 knew the fuel figures in the same way a starving man knows the weight of his own ribs. They were fighting, increasingly, with the logistics of a different century. Horses reappeared everywhere, not as ceremony, but as necessity. Artillery teams used horses to move guns that had once been dragged by trucks. Supply columns relied on wagons because wagons did not require gasoline. Ambulances sat idle while wounded men were carried by hand or left behind because the fuel was needed for something else, always something else. And yet the war demanded movement. Tanks demanded fuel, trucks demanded fuel, aircraft demanded fuel. Even stationary units demanded fuel: generators, kitchens, heaters, radios. Without fuel, modern war became an illusion. Major Voss had watched this illusion collapse day by day, not through ideology or speeches, but through the paper trail. A requisition form that came back stamped "denied." A fuel allotment reduced again. A promised delivery erased by a rail line that no longer existed. He had been in the room when commanders argued over liters, not barrels, not thousands of gallons, liters. Men who once planned operations across hundreds of kilometers now planned them like errands, measuring the distance to a crossroads and back, calculating whether there was enough fuel to move and still have enough left to retreat. But the Americans were living in a different war. Voss had first understood this in a small moment that seemed harmless at the time. December 1944. A captured American truck had been towed into a German motor pool. The Germans had expected a stripped vehicle, scavenged of anything useful before it was abandoned. Instead, they found it loaded like a pantry: canned rations, crates of ammunition, spare parts, spare tires, belts, hoses, tools still wrapped, and 2 full jerry cans strapped to the side. The truck was not special. It was not a command vehicle. It was not rare. It was ordinary. And that was the problem. The Americans were not moving a few elite units supported by careful planning. They were moving entire armies the way a healthy body moves blood. Automatically, constantly, with reserves always waiting behind the front line. The Germans could not imagine it, because nothing in their experience resembled it. Voss had spent his life in a country where every gallon was counted, guarded, argued over, and rationed. The American army treated fuel like water, something expected, something plentiful, something that could be wasted if necessary. To a German officer raised in scarcity, this was not merely a difference in capacity, it was a difference in reality. Chapter 2. The paper that ended the war. The receipt in Voss's hand was not dramatic. It was not classified. It was not a treasure map. It was the kind of paper that passed through thousands of hands each day in the Allied rear areas. A proof of issue, a logistics form, a record to prevent confusion. But for Voss, it was a window into the machinery that Germany had been trying to fight since 1942 without fully understanding it. The form had been taken from a captured American supply officer, a man too exhausted to destroy his documents before surrender. It listed the issue of fuel and supplies to a U.S. armored unit moving east. The numbers were high, not outrageous, not theatrical, simply high enough to feel wrong to a German mind. But the word unlimited was worse than any number. Unlimited meant there was no debate. Unlimited meant the supply system did not depend on luck. Unlimited meant movement was assumed. In Germany, fuel authorizations were arguments. In the American army, they were routine. Voss traced the stamped lines with his finger. He could almost see the chain behind it. Oil fields, refineries, ports, railheads, pipelines, trucks. Men whose only task was ensuring the next unit never stopped moving. The Americans had built a war machine whose primary feature was not armor or artillery. It was continuity. They could absorb loss and continue. They could burn fuel and continue. They could shift entire armies and continue. They could afford inefficiency and still continue, because the base beneath them was too wide to shake. Germany had no such base. Germany was fighting on borrowed fuel, stolen fuel, synthetic fuel, rationed fuel. Every drop was already spent in someone's plan before it arrived. This is what Voss meant when he told the lieutenant, quietly, that the receipt was the reason Germany could not win. Because the war had stopped being decided by brilliance. It was being decided by whether a truck could start in the dark. Voss folded the receipt again and slipped it back into his pocket. The convoy behind him remained motionless. Somewhere far away, artillery rumbled like a storm beyond the hills. The lieutenant waited. Finally, he asked the only question that still mattered. "What do we do, Herr Major?" Voss looked at the dead vehicles, the empty Bowser, the frozen road. And in his mind, he saw American convoys moving through France and Belgium, thousands of trucks on color-coded routes, refueling stations that never ran dry, depots that could issue unlimited and mean it. He answered without drama. "We walk," he said, "and we leave the machines behind." Chapter 3. The American Machine. Major Karl-Heinz Voss did not need intelligence briefings anymore. The truth arrived on German desks by accident, through captured paperwork, intercepted radio traffic, and the quiet testimony of abandoned machines. The American war was not fought at the front. It was fought behind it. By early 1945, the Allied armies advancing across Western Germany were being sustained by a logistics system unlike anything Europe had ever seen. It did not rely on improvisation or heroic effort. It relied on repetition, scale, and redundancy. Every American division moved with fuel already behind it. Not promised, not hoped for, already moving. Voss had first encountered the outline of this system months earlier, while studying reports from the Western Front after Normandy. The documents did not describe battles, they described flow. Ports cleared per day, tonnage unloaded per hour, vehicles cycling through maintenance depots, fuel moving inland without pause. The Americans had not merely landed armies in France, they had landed an economy. From the beaches, fuel moved forward through a layered network. Tanker ships to port depots to pipelines, pipelines to inland tank farms to railheads, railheads to truck columns to forward dumps. And none of it depended on a single point of failure. If rail was cut, trucks took over. If roads were damaged, engineers rebuilt them. If depots were threatened, fuel was moved or destroyed and replaced within days. Where German planners saw risk, the Americans saw throughput. The most alarming detail to Voss was not the size of the system, but its indifference to loss. German logistics collapsed if a single refinery was bombed. American logistics absorbed loss as a routine variable. In December 1944, Allied engineers deliberately destroyed millions of gallons of fuel rather than allow capture. This was not a desperate act, it was standard doctrine. Destroy it, replace it, move on. Voss understood what that meant. Germany fought a war where every gallon had a history and a future. America fought a war where fuel existed only to be consumed. This was not waste, it was dominance. Chapter 4. Pipelines instead of roads. The moment that finally shattered Voss's remaining illusions came from a report he was never meant to see. It arrived folded inside a captured American field notebook, translated by a junior clerk who did not fully grasp its significance. The clerk passed it up because the numbers seemed unusual. The report described something called a pipelines section, with daily delivery figures attached. Voss read it twice, then a third time. The Americans had laid pipelines across the English Channel. Underwater, continuous, pumping fuel directly from Britain into France. Not symbolic pipelines, industrial pipelines. Fuel moved through them day and night, invisible to aircraft, immune to weather, protected by redundancy. If one section failed, another carried the load. From the coast, these pipelines branched inland like arteries, feeding tank farms near major cities, railheads, and operational hubs. One line alone delivered hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. Voss compared this to German fuel movement. Germany relied on rail. Rail relied on intact bridges. Bridges relied on not being bombed. Bombing happened daily. German synthetic fuel plants were stationary, exposed, and fragile. Each bombing raid reduced output for weeks. Repairs took longer than the next attack allowed. American fuel infrastructure, by contrast, was mobile, modular, and layered. Damage slowed it. It did not stop it. Voss wrote a private note in the margin of the report, something he never submitted officially. They have built a war that cannot be interrupted. Chapter 5. What unlimited really means. The word unlimited haunted Voss. He began to notice it everywhere in captured American paperwork. Unlimited movement authority, unlimited fuel draw within operational area, unlimited replacement vehicles upon loss. It did not mean waste, it meant assumption. American commanders assumed fuel would arrive. They assumed vehicles would be replaced. They assumed losses would be absorbed. German commanders planned operations around what might arrive. This difference reshaped behavior. American units maneuvered freely. They took detours. They repositioned aggressively. They pursued retreating enemies without hesitation. German units halted constantly. They consolidated fuel. They abandoned equipment, not because it was damaged, but because it could not be moved. Voss saw the consequences firsthand during the retreat toward the Rhine. German columns moved by night to conserve fuel and avoid aircraft. Engines were shut down during halts. Orders were issued to tow vehicles only when absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, American columns moved by day, engines running, heaters on, trucks idling while drivers ate. Captured German soldiers reported the same detail again and again. The Americans leave their engines running. To a German soldier, this was not arrogance. It was madness. To Voss, it was proof. Only an army with absolute confidence in supply could behave that way. Chapter 6. The Arithmetic of Movement. By February 1945, Voss began performing calculations not to plan victory, but to understand inevitability. He compared fuel consumption rates. A German Panther tank consumed over 1 liter per kilometer under combat conditions. A Tiger burned even more. Heavy vehicles consumed fuel at rates that made maneuver expensive even when fuel existed. American tanks consumed less. Their trucks were standardized, efficient, interchangeable. Maintenance was simplified. Parts flowed easily. More importantly, American consumption was irrelevant because supply exceeded demand. The Americans did not ask whether they could afford to move, they asked where to move next. Voss reviewed intercepted American radio traffic, indicating daily fuel deliveries that exceeded Germany's monthly allocations. He realized something deeply unsettling. Even if Germany somehow destroyed half of American fuel capacity, it would not matter. The remainder would still dwarf German production. This was not a war that could be won by denial. It was a war that could only be lost slowly. Chapter 7. The Officer Who Understood Too Late. The convoy outside Prüm never moved again. By dawn, the men had stripped the vehicles of anything portable: radios, weapons, maps. The rest was left where it stood. Voss watched as soldiers walked past machines they had once been proud to serve. Perfectly functional trucks, half-tracks with intact engines, vehicles that represented years of industrial effort. All abandoned because of fuel. He thought again of the receipt, not the quantities, but the confidence. Unlimited meant the Americans could make mistakes. It meant they could overextend and recover. It meant they could lose and replace. Germany had no such margin. As the men began their march east on foot, Voss understood the truth that no propaganda could erase. The Americans were not better soldiers. They were not braver men. They were not even more skilled commanders. They were backed by a system so vast that individual battles no longer mattered. This was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was obsolescence. Germany was fighting a modern industrial empire with the resources of a besieged state. No amount of courage could close that gap. Voss folded his gloves tighter around his hands and stepped onto the road. Behind him, engines cooled. Ahead of him, the war continued without Germany's consent. Chapter 8. The Depot. The depot lay just beyond the edge of a ruined village. Its name no longer mattered. The sign had been shattered, the letters scattered in the mud. What remained was a wide, open field, crisscrossed with tire tracks and bordered by temporary fencing that had already been cut through in several places. Major Karl-Heinz Voss arrived there 2 days after the American units had moved on. He had not been sent to inspect it. No one had ordered him to go. He went because he needed to see it himself. The ground was dark with spilled fuel. Empty jerry cans lay everywhere, some crushed flat by trucks, others still stacked neatly where no one had bothered to retrieve them. Wooden crates had been broken open and discarded, their contents taken or simply ignored. There were tire marks everywhere, heavy ones, repeated passes. This had not been a hurried evacuation. This had been routine movement. Voss walked slowly, his boots slipping slightly on the damp soil. He stopped beside a pile of jerry cans, each stamped with American markings. 5 gallons each. Dozens of them. Hundreds. A corporal nearby lifted one, shook it, and laughed softly. "Still fuel inside," he said. "They didn't even drain them." Voss nodded, but said nothing. He had already seen the manifests. This depot had held more fuel than his entire sector had received in the past 3 months, and it had been classified, according to American doctrine, as temporary. Not a main supply hub, not a strategic reserve, temporary. The Americans had not fought to defend it. They had not booby-trapped it. They had not even destroyed most of it. They had simply moved on. For Voss, this was worse than fire. Chapter 9. Waste as a Weapon. The German understanding of waste was shaped by years of deprivation. Waste meant incompetence. Waste meant criminal negligence. Waste meant punishment. In the American Army, waste meant speed. Voss had spoken with prisoners who described how American units operated. Engines left running during short halts. Vehicles abandoned if they slowed movement. Supplies discarded rather than reorganized. If something could not move fast enough, it was replaced. This behavior horrified German officers. It violated every instinct they had been trained to trust. But it worked. American formations advanced without pause. Their momentum came not from brilliance, but from refusal to slow down. Voss realized that American waste was not carelessness. It was insulation. They were insulated from consequence. A German unit that wasted fuel ceased to exist. An American unit that wasted fuel submitted a report and received more. This was not cultural, it was structural. The Americans could afford to be inefficient because their base was infinite by comparison. Chapter 10. Replacement Speed. The most demoralizing reports Voss read were not about American firepower. They were about replacement. A destroyed American truck did not represent a loss. It represented a delay. German units recorded enemy vehicles destroyed with pride, only to encounter identical vehicles days later, sometimes on the same road. American tanks destroyed in battle were replaced within weeks, sometimes days. Voss reviewed an intelligence summary, noting that a U.S. armored division had lost over 40 tanks in January and was back to full strength before February. Germany could not replace 40 tanks in a month. Not with fuel, not with crews, not with spare parts. The Americans replaced machines the way Germany replaced men. And even men were easier to replace in the American system. Voss read casualty figures with growing unease. American losses were absorbed without operational collapse. German losses hollowed units permanently. This was not resilience. It was scale. Chapter 11. The Conversation. The realization spread quietly. It passed between officers in low voices, in dugouts and ruined houses, always without witnesses. Voss remembered one conversation in particular. A regimental commander, older than him, with tired eyes and a voice worn thin by months of retreat, spoke while staring at a map he no longer believed in. "They are not better than us," the commander said. "They are just endless." He tapped the map with a finger. "We fight here, they replace. We retreat, they pursue. We stop, they move. There is no maneuver that changes this." Voss did not disagree. He thought again of the receipt. Unlimited. Chapter 12. The End of Illusion. By March 1945, the German army was still fighting, but no longer pretending. Orders spoke of holding actions, of delaying tactics, of preserving strength for negotiations that no one believed would happen. Fuel allocations shrank further. Some units received fuel only for generators, not vehicles. Others received none at all. American columns rolled past abandoned German equipment daily. Tanks with intact armor, trucks with undamaged engines, artillery pieces with ammunition still stacked nearby. All silent, all useless. Voss passed one such site outside a crossroads, where 3 German half-tracks sat in a neat line, parked as if awaiting orders. They had run out of fuel together. He stopped and touched the side of one vehicle, feeling the cold metal under his glove. Somewhere far to the west, American refineries continued to run without interruption. Oil flowed from Texas and California. Tankers crossed the Atlantic, pipelines pumped inland, trucks rolled forward. The war was not being decided by who wanted it more. It was being decided by who could keep moving. Chapter 13. What defeat actually looked like. Defeat did not arrive with surrender papers. It arrived with silence. No engines, no convoys, no radios transmitting orders to move. The German army became static, not by choice, but by exhaustion. American forces maneuvered around it like water around a rock. Voss understood now that the war had ended long before the final shots. It had ended the moment Germany faced an enemy whose logistics could not be meaningfully disrupted. An enemy who could replace everything faster than it could be destroyed. An enemy who could burn fuel to deny it rather than preserve it. An enemy who did not count liters. Chapter 14. The war after it was lost. By the time Major Karl-Heinz Voss crossed the Rhine on foot, the war had already ended in every way that mattered. Not officially, not politically, but mechanically. Germany was still issuing orders. Units still carried weapons. Officers still marked maps. But the machine that turned intention into action no longer functioned. The Americans were not slowing down. They were accelerating. Entire U.S. armies shifted direction in days. Patton's Third Army pivoted north and then east, consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons simply to reposition. What would have been impossible for German planners was routine for American logisticians. The numbers alone were devastating. By early 1945, Allied forces in Western Europe were consuming millions of gallons of fuel per day and still increasing reserves. Germany could not match that output in a month, often not in a year. For Voss, this was the final confirmation of something he had already understood in February. Germany was no longer fighting a war. It was enduring a process. Chapter 15. Why tactics no longer mattered. German officers had been trained to believe in maneuver, surprise, and operational brilliance. These ideas had brought victory in earlier years, but by 1944, tactics had become irrelevant. A brilliant maneuver still required fuel. A successful breakthrough still required movement. A decisive counterattack still required supply. America could absorb tactical setbacks without consequence. Germany could not afford tactical success if it cost fuel. This reversed every assumption of modern warfare. The Americans could lose a battle and continue the war unchanged. Germany could win a skirmish and still collapse. Voss understood now why American commanders behaved the way they did. They were not reckless. They were liberated from constraint. Where German commanders hesitated, Americans advanced. Where Germans consolidated, Americans pursued. Where Germans paused to calculate, Americans acted. They could do this because their logistics were not fragile. They were overwhelming. Chapter 16. The scale Germany never faced before. Germany had fought industrial powers before: Britain, France, even the Soviet Union. But the United States represented something new. By 1944, America produced more than half of the world's manufactured goods. Its oil production dwarfed every other nation combined. Its factories operated without interruption. Its transport networks spanned oceans. American industry did not surge for war. It normalized war. A new aircraft rolled off American production lines every few minutes. Ships were launched daily. Vehicles were built in quantities that erased the meaning of loss. Fuel was the clearest expression of this imbalance. Germany relied on synthetic fuel plants that could be destroyed in hours and repaired in weeks. America relied on vast oil fields and refineries spread across an entire continent. The Americans did not protect fuel by scarcity. They protected it by abundance. Voss realized that even if Germany had avoided strategic bombing, avoided certain defeats, avoided catastrophic decisions, the outcome would not have changed. The base imbalance was too large. Germany could not scale fast enough. America did not need to. Chapter 17. Recognition without illusion. The most damaging effect of American abundance was psychological. German soldiers did not surrender because they were afraid of American weapons. They surrendered because they saw the future and recognized their place in it. Captured soldiers spoke of American waste with disbelief. Engines left running, food discarded, fuel burned deliberately. These sights undermined every narrative Germany had built about enemy weakness. The war had been framed as a struggle against decadent opponents who lacked discipline and endurance. Reality destroyed that illusion. The Americans did not lack discipline. They had margin. Voss saw this realization spread through the ranks faster than any official communication could suppress it. Men wrote letters home describing American supply dumps larger than German towns. They described trucks moving endlessly, day and night. They described an enemy that did not slow down because it did not need to. Censorship could not erase numbers once they were seen. Chapter 18. After the Surrender. Voss survived the war. He was captured in April 1945, not during a battle, but while walking east with a group of officers whose vehicles had long since been abandoned. In captivity, he encountered American logistics from the inside. Prisoner camps were supplied regularly. Food arrived on schedule. Medical supplies were available. Vehicles came and went without visible concern for fuel. Even in victory, the Americans operated the same way. There was no tightening of belts, no emergency measures. The machine simply kept running. Years later, when Voss was interviewed for a post-war study on German logistics failures, he was asked when he knew the war was lost. He did not cite Stalingrad. He did not cite Normandy. He did not cite the Rhine. He described a receipt, a piece of paper that said, "Unlimited." He explained that it was not the quantity that mattered, but the assumption behind it. The assumption that movement would continue. Chapter 19. What that day represented. The day a German officer realized America could not be defeated was not a single date on a calendar. It was a moment of comprehension, a moment when the nature of modern warfare became unavoidable. Industrial war was not decided by courage or competence alone. It was decided by production, logistics, and the ability to replace faster than the enemy could destroy. America did not win because it fought harder. It won because it produced more, moved more, and sustained more than any opponent could meaningfully challenge. Once that reality became visible to German officers like Voss, the war's outcome was no longer in question, only its duration. Final image. The still vehicles. In the years after the war, abandoned German vehicles were catalogued and scrapped across Europe. Investigators often found the same note in salvage reports. Vehicle operational, cause of abandonment, fuel exhaustion. Perfect machines, experienced crews, no movement. American salvage teams noted that recovering many of these vehicles required only a few thousand gallons of fuel and a few hours of work. What had been impossible for Germany was trivial for America. That contrast was the war. Closing. The story of Major Karl-Heinz Voss is not unique because of who he was. It matters because of what he saw. He saw an enemy whose logistics could not be exhausted. He saw a war where scarcity faced abundance. He saw that the outcome was no longer a question of strategy. When Germany confronted American industrial power directly, the war ended in principle, even if it continued in blood. The day a German officer realized America could not be defeated was the day the modern understanding of warfare became unavoidable. Victory belonged not to those who fought best, but to those who could supply endlessly. And once that truth was seen, it could not be unseen.
If stories like this matter to you,
Stories not about legends, but about limits, consider subscribing for more quiet histories like this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.